Paul is going to use this and other concepts in our passage today to build a bridge of communication between himself and the Athenians. Today we'll see him not preaching to a synagogue, but preaching in the marketplace, not preaching to Jewish people with a background of Torah and the prophets and the writings, but to a group of Gentiles, pagans, steeped in the philosophies of the day. How to communicate to a culture so very different than the one from which Paul emerges. We're going to see a master communicator today. So let us first make sure, because it's been a couple of weeks since I gave you an introduction to this passage, let's do a quick recap as to where we are. We find ourselves in Athens, named after, of course, the goddess Athena. And, of course, we know Athens has the magnificent Parthenon, that is the temple dedicated to Athena. And it is atop the Acropolis, the craggy hill around which the city is built. This is my family looking at the Acropolis from our hotel roof in our 2018 visit. What a lovely family. My big, fat Greek family. Well, now, verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them, for his associates at Athens, Timothy, Silas, his spirit was being provoked within him. In other words, he was getting mighty perturbed as he was observing the city full of idols. He, like so many first-time visitors to Athens, takes a tour. And as he wanders around, he sees, for Paul, these are no mere works of art like they would be to us, our culture. This is an appalling plethora of idols representing pagan deities. This is what is left today of the temple of Zeus. It is quite an extraordinary sight to see in Athens. This is the Agora, and it is literally the streets, the marketplace, the streets are lined with statuary dedicated and altars and temples dedicated to various gods. Petronius said it was easier to find a god in Athens than a man. Well, time on his hands and much too impatient to wait for his companions, Paul determines to begin the Athenian mission without them. Of course, here we have, this is another great image of Athena, the goddess of the city, and of course, altar of Zeus. They're everywhere you turn. It's not like Dallas where, everywhere we say, everywhere you turn, there's either a church or a shopping mall, okay? No. Literally, every few feet, sometimes every few yards, is another statue, is another pagan god, is another temple, is another altar to various different, it's jam-packed. It's like the expensive kind of chocolate chip cookies that you buy in the mall that are like really jam-packed with chocolate chips. That's how Athens was with gods. So, he was reasoning with the Jews in the synagogue, and in the synagogue with the God-fearing Gentiles. The synagogue attendants made up of Jewish people, and those Gentiles were attracted to the God of Israel. So, God-fearing Gentiles and Jews, but then also, instead of just concentrating just on the synagogue, as we've seen him do in every location thus far, in both first and second missionary journeys, he is burning the candle at both ends and is preaching to the Jews in the synagogue and to the pagans in the marketplace, in the public square, every day with those who happened to be present. This is what is left of the marketplace, of the Agora. That is the main passageway, the main walkway, throughway, which I showed you earlier, a little different perspective. But no matter where you go in the agora, there is evidence of worship and acknowledgement of pagan gods. And also, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Now, let's just spend a moment. This is about as far as I got in the introduction last time. But I think it would be helpful in understanding where Paul is going and the bridge that he's building for us to have a little bit of a background on these two. Luke thought it was important enough to mention that specifically the Epicureans and the Stoics were conversing with him. They were engaged in this conversation. So what were the Epicureans like? Well, of course, this is Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism. That's not the founder of the wine and food magazine or the channel. This is the philosophy of Epicureanism. Epicurus, it's a very handsome beard, I think. But we could summarize Epicureanism in this way. The pursuit of pleasure was humanity's highest goal, the pursuit of pleasure. And conversely, the absence of pain was the chief good. And in a sense, if there was an absence of pain, then one could find pleasure in the fact that there was no pain. Where there was pain, it was hard to pursue pleasure. So the goal was pleasure and the avoidance of pain. It also posited that nothing was knowable beyond the perceptible, because so much was laid on the senses, the importance of the senses. Therefore, nothing knowable, nothing that goes beyond the senses was available. Only what you could perceive by your senses was knowable. Virtue was required for happiness. And let's talk about God. God, or gods, if they existed, were indifferent to, and they were uninvolved with humanity. One could think of Epicureanism as a sort of a deism, a proto-deism. So again, indifferent, uninvolved with humanity, but in a sense there was an agnosticism, there was an atheism present in the Epicureanism, and in fact that of course led them to denying any kind of intelligent design in creation, in nature. And if there's no God, then there's no afterlife as well. So that's Epicureanism in a nutshell. Now, this was something that the Jewish people really interacted. You see the rabbis really interacting with the Epicurean philosophy. And in fact, Josephus in Antiquities tells us this regarding the Epicureans. The Epicureans are in an error who cast providence, in other words, the working of God, out of human life and do not believe that God takes care of the affairs of the world. This, like the watchmaker, if God exists, he's like a watchmaker who just round the clock and took a hike. Nor that the universe is governed and continued in being by that blessed and immortal nature, but say that the world is carried along of its own accord. No ruler and no curator. So it is a world of the senses. Happiness is the chief good. And God, if he even exists, or gods or some whatever deity, they're unknowable and uninvolved with humanity. The rabbis have a few things to say about that. In the Mishnah, Perkei Avot 2:14, Rabbi Elazar said, "Be diligent in the study of the Torah and know how to answer an Epicurean." Well, they made the Mishnah. Wow. "And know before whom you toil, and that your employer is faithful, for he will pay you the reward of your labor." So study the Torah, and that is a good solution to be able to counter, to answer, to rebuke the argument of an Epicurean, because you know before whom you work. You know whom you serve. It's a God who actually, according to Torah, is very much involved, is immanent and present in our world, not like the Epicureans teach. In the Jerusalem Talmud, Sanhedrin 10:1, we find this statement: all of Israel have a part in the world to come, but the following have no part in the world to come. One who says that the resurrection of the dead is not biblical. We're going to see the resurrection spoken of today, okay? And how controversial the concept of resurrection of the dead is, particularly among the Stoics and the Epicureans, the philosophers of Athens. So one who says reject the resurrection of the dead, not biblical, or that the Torah is not from heaven, or these guys are not going to make it into the world to come. The Epicurean, who holds that the world is an assembly of atoms subject to random events. Oh, it sounds like they've been reading the bestsellers by Dawkins and Hitchens, doesn't it? Well, they predate them very much. Okay, so let's move to Stoicism. We have Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. Now, Zeno, 3.5 centuries or 3 1/3 centuries prior to Paul. Zeno was born and lived in Tarsus. That's Paul's hometown. So Stoicism was around for a while. It sprung specifically from Tarsus, Paul's hometown, but it spread quite wildly and widely in the 3+ centuries since Zeno lived. So we get to Paul in Athens, and here's what Stoicism believed. That 4 pillars: fortitude, justice, temperance, and prudence. By these 4 things, they basically meant self-control, temperance, prudence, all things, not just in moderation, but all things taken in a sense dispassionately, with a level of self-control. And one was to live life in agreement with nature and in accordance with natural theology. Paul is that which is revealed within nature itself. So in a sense, not just Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau's Walden, the idea of nature and living in accord with nature. But Paul is going to actually capitalize on this concept of natural theology, not here in Acts so much. I mean, it's just a little bit in this short sermon, but in other passages where he speaks of general revelation and what can be ascertained regarding God through nature, through general revelation. Emotions are to be controlled, apatheia. So if you think about Stoics and the control of emotions, it's not obviously that they don't have emotions, it's that they control. The goal was to control your emotions, not to be a slave to your passions. Think of Mr. Spock in Star Trek. Vulcans have emotions, but they have learned how to subjugate the emotions and how to control the emotions. And that's why Spock, every time he gets into a jam or is poisoned by some planetary substance, begins to lose control, because self-control is how he lives. Right? Pleasure is a vice, and enduring pain a virtue. So take Epicureanism and turn it on its head, okay? So if you enjoy yourself too much, that's a vice. Enduring pain, if you can put up with what life hands you, if you can endure it quietly, so the old British stiff upper lip, right? You can make a virtue out of enduring pain. Stiff upper lip, that's Stoicism. Happiness depends on our conscious choices and accepting what is in our power to achieve. Now, that sounds just fine, except that they live within a system that that taught determinism. In other words, everything is fated. So you may think you're making your choices, but actually everything has been predetermined. It's just that you're not aware, while you're making your choice, you're not aware that it is of what has been determined. Will you have chocolate ice cream? Will you have vanilla ice cream? You don't know what has been determined, and so you're making a conscious choice. And so your happiness depends on the choices that you make, your ability to live with the conscious choices that you have made, and to accept. There are some things that are simply not within your power to achieve. If a hurricane comes or tornado comes and knocks your house down, or the big bad wolf comes and blows your house down, that's not within your power to maintain the structure. Some things just happen. How you react to the circumstances of life, however, is within your power. Okay, you do not. Your buttons, in other words, don't have to be pressed. Well, he made me so angry. No. You allowed him to make you angry. My work is so stressful. Well, you're allowing the responsibilities that you have at work to create stress in your life. That's Stoicism. Regarding God, God is not a personality. He's a rational force. So there's rationality there. There's thinking, but it's a force, not a person. Think not Star Trek in this instance, but Star Wars. May the force be with you. And this force governs the world. It's not localized. God is not localized to live in a temple. A force is not contained in a box or in a temple. A force has no needs. And the force permeates all nature. You may have seen this in any one of the 9 Star Wars films. They also have a cyclical view of history, as opposed to what the Bible teaches, that we have a linear view of history. Begins in the beginning, God created, and there is an ending. So we are anywhere along the line of a linear history. But the Stoics believed that there were cycles of beginning and destruction, and then the whole system begins again. The universe is created, comes into existence, and then it burns itself out. Cyclical view, and it's the most popular of the first century philosophy. So a lot of the people that Paul was speaking to, in other words, in the marketplace in Athens, were Stoics. The difference, if you will, I didn't make this up. This is just the general joke that differentiates the Epicureans from the Stoics. You go out to dinner, and the waiter brings you your soup. You take your spoon, you taste the soup. The soup is cold. It's not meant to be cold. It's not gazpacho. It's wonton soup or chicken soup, whatever. It's supposed to be hot, but it's actually cold. Will you quickly call the waiter because you can't enjoy a soup that's meant to be hot that's actually cold? Or will you quietly stiff upper lip? Will you endure it and not call the waiter? So depending on if you call the waiter or you just endure it and eat it, okay, makes you an Epicurean or a Stoic. That's one good way of telling the two apart. Some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange, exotic deities. Where they come up with this, they heard him teaching about Jesus, and the anastasis, the resurrection. And not understanding the concept of resurrection, just hearing about Jesus and the anastasis, they assumed, again, putting in their context, that Jesus is the God, and anastasis is his consort, Mrs. God, the female consort of Jesus. So it's a variety of responses to his claim. Some thought it was whatever he had to say wasn't important. Some thought, oh, these are two new interesting gods. But according to Roman law, the introduction of new religions was prohibited. It was the very idea, the introduction of new religion that resulted in the death, the execution of Socrates, right? The most famous of the classical philosophers of Greece. But one thing that Luke adds to the narrative here, as they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are proclaiming? We'd like to hear more. Now, this is your average pagan philosopher in the agora who wants to hear more. You can say, we'd like to hear more of this. For you're bringing some strange things to our ears, so we want to know what these things mean. We don't necessarily have contexts to be able to assign to the concepts that you're teaching. We would like some further elaboration. Now, here's the parenthetical expression that Luke provides. Now, all the Athenians and strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. So Luke tells us that the Athenians are kind of like intellectual floozies, and they're exhibiting a marked propensity for loitering around the agora. Here we have several of them, guys, waiting for the proclamation of novel new ideas and fads that they can discuss, that they can make fun of, that they can accept, that they can reject, that they can argue against. And the philosophers of the day lived for these stimulating opportunities, and so they request that Paul is going to explain the strange and surprising things of which he wrote. And so here we have, this is the what's called Mars Hill, the area of the Areopagus. This is where the religious council, the chief judicial body of Athens, met, the 30-member council of the Areopagus. They were responsible for supervising the propagation of the religion, in other words, the education of the Athenians. So in the sense that many of us are worried about the state imposing on our children in the public schools what they're learning and indoctrinating them into whatever we're worried about them being indoctrinated, so too there's no choice. The Areopagus determined what was going to be taught of the school children by the teachers and what was acceptable in the culture. This rocky hill, the Hill of Ares, the Mars Hill, juts up right in the shadow of the Acropolis. The Acropolis is actually as you're looking, is right to your left. Let's see if I have another photo that I can show you how it looks, but it's right there. You can see it right there. And of course, this is many years ago. That's my son, my niece, and my wife, all the way, way up on the top of the Mars Hill, the Areopagus. Now, if we could summarize Paul's message that he's going to deliver to the Athenian council, we have him discussing God. Now, his witness really takes us in 10 verses from creation to resurrection. It's a masterful, talking about building a bridge and doing a contextual communication so that one culture's concepts could be understood, whether they're accepted or not, it's a different story, but understood by another culture. This is like a master class here. And so we'll begin with God, as Paul does. He begins with God. And is the God that he's speaking of a God that is already worshipped here? Who is this God? Where is this God? What is this God like? So in other words, are you already familiar with this God? Who is this God then? And where is this God? Where is he located? And what can we know about God? These are good basic questions that he leads with. And then he moves from God to humanity. And he speaks of humanity's past, humanity's present, and humanity's future. And then he moves to God's relation. So you've got God, you've got humanity, and what's the relationship between the two? God's relationship with humanity speaks of the immanence of God to humanity, humanity's responsibility to God, and God's future judgment of humanity through his risen judge. So God, humanity, and then the relationship between the two. Where is God in relation to humanity? What is humanity's responsibility toward God, if any? And is there any future judgment that is coming from God to humanity? How will it be done? Will it be accomplished, as Paul argues, through his risen, resurrected judge? That's Paul's message in 3 major components. 10 verses. Boom. So, here's the witness. Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects." Okay, now he is addressing the chief council of Athens. This is the legislative, religious council, all with no separation between church and state in those days. This is where we see Paul's Hellenistic, his Greek backgrounds, his education as a young person and later as an adult, just living in Tarsus. This is where we see that education shine through. See, because at this point, Paul has to temporarily remove his metaphorical prayer shawl from his shoulders and don his philosopher's robes. He can't base his evangelistic argument on Hebrew scripture. That wasn't familiar, nor would it be accepted as authoritative by the audience. I can't even bank on the assumption of monotheism. Paul is compelled to an alternative point of contact from which to build this bridge of communication. Can he find common ground between himself and the Areopagus? Paul is going to artfully move from creation to resurrection, and again in 10 verses, not standing on one leg, but all the while avoiding the presentation of Jewish concepts devoid of a Gentile context. Watch this. In this introduction, Paul, it could be an insult. I see you're very superstitious. Let's not take it that way. You're very religious people in all respects. You are far more, Athens, you guys are far more religious than the average bear. He doesn't express his repulsion for their idolatry. He doesn't falsely compliment it. He simply states something right through the middle, right? Of course, if there had been any Jewish people who were present, they might have appreciated the little double entendre. The word that Paul uses for religious is understood by Jews in a non-dictionary, but just kind of a common sense, as those who are fearful of the demonic. So he doesn't insult anybody. He just says you're religious, and he talks about the fact that he was taking a tour, right? Taking in the sights and sounds of the city, observing the stunning variety of objects, contemplating the objects that are worshipped, and he happens on an altar that is inscribed to an unknown God. So for a while, I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, a tourist. I also found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God, agnosto theo. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. So the Athenians put out an insurance policy, right, against invoking the divine wrath of any slighted god or goddess who they might have neglected to worship. So they cover all the bases, and they say, here's an altar to the unknown God, okay? Just in case we leave somebody out, we don't want any gods getting mad at us. It's like an insurance policy. So Paul, first charge that's going to be made against him is you're preaching a new religion. Paul deftly sidesteps much more gracefully than Harry Potter did in the musical number. He sidesteps that accusation before it's made because he's simply expounding a religion they were already observing and telling them about a God they already worshipped. And so, this I proclaim to you. In fact, this is a monument to an unknown. It's not the one that he found, but it's a monument. These are found in various archaeological circumstances throughout the ancient Roman and Greco-Roman world. He's going to tell them about the God, the unknown God. So he'll be known to them. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with human hands. So, okay, there's a little bit for everybody. In contrast to the belief of the pantheistic Stoics and this concept of force, God is not some impersonal force infusing all matter, like, pantheism. He's the Lord and creator of the universe. And there's only one true God. There isn't actually a pantheon of gods. And as Lord of the universe, this God cannot be contained in handmade temples. He does not dwell in temples made with human hands, not even one as magnificent as the one dedicated to Athena atop the Acropolis that was in full view, was right there. They were in the shadow of the Acropolis, elevated majestically above the Areopagus. God cannot be contained. Of course, this is just a ruin now. Imagine what it looked like in its full glory in the days of the New Testament. This is another temple that, again, is right there on the other side of the shadow of the Areopagus. Beautiful, right? Visible to every Athenian. But not only is he unable to be contained, God is self-sufficient. He has no need of offerings for his well-being, for his happiness. But while God has no needs, humanity desperately has needs for life and breath, and all else are his gifts. He is not served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. So, having made a few points about God, he moves on to humanity. Now, I want you to notice, yes, here we go. He made from one man, this is where we talk about the brotherhood of man, the connection between Paul and the Athenians, the connection between the Jews and the pagans, the connection between every individual on the earth and their God. He made this God, this unknown God that I'm telling you about, that I'm making known to you. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined the appointed times and boundaries of their habitation. Right? He doesn't quote the first few chapters of Genesis. Doesn't need to. He nonetheless gets across the basic gist of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Explains that since all humanity descends from one man. All men are brothers. We're all connected, all with a common origin. That noble tie that binds all human hearts and minds into one brotherhood of man. And while the Stoics, they bought that. The Stoics believed in the brotherhood of mankind. They could have sung along with Harry Potter. But few Athenians would accept that the basis of the brotherhood of man was humanity's common origin. The Athenians, alone among the Greeks, and having no history of ancestral immigration to Athens or from elsewhere, the Athenians claimed to be unique among all peoples, and having sprung up from the soil of Athens. That's how the Athenians were birthed, by springing up from the soil. Just like Wonder Woman created by clay, molded by her mother and brought to life, so too the Athenians sprung to life from the soil of their regions. But remember that the Epicureans are deists, and Paul insists that God is firmly in control of human history and active in its affairs. The Athenians did not spring up from Athens on their own spontaneously. Spontaneous generation, contrary to their mythology. God himself created them. This is why, because the Bible is so strongly emphasizes the brotherhood of man, the common origin of man, and that all are connected, to raise one group above another would seem to be antithetical to what the Bible teaches. You know, you've seen the news this week, there's a Supreme Court opening. And, I don't speak politics. I don't talk about politics at all. But you know that our president has made the litmus test, if one could call it that, for the judge that he'll be appointing, that he'll be selecting and putting forward to the process of advice and consent to the Senate. Not whether or not they're experienced, not whether or not they are the sharpest judicial mind available, not whether or not they have a long resume of experience in the judiciary. Our president has as his determinative point the sex and the skin color of this candidate. To choose someone on the basis of their skin color is, pardon me for being educated and raised in the 70s as a child in light of the great Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It would seem to me that to elevate one skin color as the be-all and end-all to fit this particular job would be, could I say racist? I don't know. I just throw that word out there if it even still retains any meaning today. And sexist, if that word has any meaning today. How'd you get your job? Just as so-and-so? Is it because of where you went to school? Is it because of your long history of fair and learned rulings that are not overturned by higher courts because of your lousy reasoning? No, I got my job because of my color. I got my job because of what genitals I have between my appendages. It would seem that we're going in the wrong direction as a culture and as a nation, and certainly antithetical to what Paul is teaching here in Acts 17, let alone what the pagans believed. If our president is acting in contradiction to what the learned pagans believed in 2,000 years ago, we could say, wow, we are really far off the mark. He's blowing the biblical truths. He's also blowing the philosophical pagan truths of the ancients as well. Such as it is. Well, because we are brothers, one people. Doesn't mean that there aren't distinctions. There are black, there are white, obviously we're in a Messianic congregation. There are Jews and there are Gentiles, right? We maintain that there are still distinctives between Jews and Gentiles and men and women and socioeconomically, those who are very successful, those who are less successful, those who are in the middle. We recognize distinctions and divisions. They don't disappear. It's just that in the eyes of God, we're all equal because we all come from common stock. There's a brotherhood of man, and God is the creator, and we all come from a common ancestor. Name was Adam. His best gal was Eve. And from the two of them comes everyone else. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation. By the way, Deuteronomy 32:8 says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of mankind, when did that happen? After the Tower of Babel in Genesis, the early chapters, the prologue of Genesis, separated them. He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. So God determined the location, the boundaries of all nations, and in fact, he did it in relation to the population of Israel according to the Torah. Well, let's move on. Paul definitely moves on to humanity's relationship with God. We don't have time to develop that now, but I hope I've given you food for thought, because we will continue this thought. We will continue Paul's message, Paul's bridging the gap, but I want you to think of just a few things, a few thoughts that I want you to end the morning with. Regarding Epicureanism, Stoicism, and what Paul said. Neither Epicureanism nor Stoicism's views ever completely dissolved into history's ether. Epicurean ideas live on today in the contemporary rise of the hip new atheism, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, and so many others. The rejection of intelligent design, forget creationism, just seriously, intelligent design, rejecting that. The assiduous society's assiduous pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain at all costs. We have a very upsetting, a shameful epidemic in our nation. Not talking about COVID or anything like this. Talking about fentanyl. Talking about drug abuse. Talking about how many people, including my own niece, died of addiction, overdose. In the relentless, headlong, headstrong, assiduous pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. The answer is not to be found in Epicureanism or in anything society has for us. It's to be found in the words of Scripture. and on the God of Scripture and in his Son. Christoicism's ideas live on in much of the deafening drumbeat of warnings regarding climate change, alongside the view that God is in everything and is everything. Not to mention both Star Wars, may the Force be with you, and Star Trek, Mr. Spock, control your emotions. Paul's ideas also continue to persist and persuade. Now, I know you haven't been exposed to the entirety of his argument, but you've seen Paul argue earlier throughout the book of Acts thus far. Are you persuaded by his argument? Do you agree that it's most reasonable to see God as the creator of the universe, a knowable, immanent, involved deity who has expectations of humanity? Now, I know we haven't come to this part, but one who is appointed an agent of coming judgment, one who's demonstrated his credentials through the resurrection. You can read ahead, see if that makes sense, or read behind and see what Paul has been saying and Peter before him in the previous 16 chapters. Or is it that you still need more time to consider these challenging ideas? We live in a time of uncertainty. We live in a time when tomorrow is not guaranteed to anyone. Don't take too long to consider truly and wrestle with the challenging ideas of Scripture.